Now, before we conclude our talk today, we need to consider one more question. So far, we've been asking, how did these two men from such utterly different backgrounds come together and find they had so much in common? But now, let's turn that question around and say, okay, we get that Krishnamurti and Bohm had a lot in common, but once they got together, what were the differences between them? Did they always see eye to eye on everything? Did they have a complete meeting of minds? One way to approach this question is by looking at their different styles in their conduct of group meetings. And there's a passage in my book that illustrates this issue. In his conduct of group meetings, Bohm was the antithesis, in some respects, of Krishnamurti. The latter, Krishnamurti, was quick to correct errors of language or logic, and he engendered an atmosphere that was austere. By contrast, Bohm was like a shy and friendly uncle, endlessly tolerant of all the imperfections in the family. It was said by some who knew them both that Krishnamurti began his answer to every question with no, whereas Bohm answered every question with yes. But at a deeper level, how did it all turn out between Krishnamurti and Bohm? They published 4 books of their dialogues with one another, and in some cases it appeared that Bohm was the dominant personality. He tended to initiate the conversation, and it often appeared that he was leading the discussion. In addition, Bohm had an extraordinary facility for lucid, comprehensible explanations, whether in the field of physics or in the field of consciousness. Krishnamurti, by contrast, was sometimes a little bit difficult to follow. His teachings were like a vast mountain range, like the Sierra Nevada, where many listeners were able to follow him into the foothills, and some could climb the lower or middle peaks, but very few, if anyone, could follow him to the very summit of his teachings. And people often went away from the talks wondering exactly what it was that he meant. This kind of thing didn't occur very often with Bohm. People who listened generally felt that his exposition was crystal clear and not obscure at any level. And therefore we are led to ask, was Bohm's understanding of the landscape of consciousness on an equal level, or maybe even superior to Krishnamurti's? On this point, I think the answer is unequivocal. Krishnamurti's insight into thought and consciousness were much more penetrating than Bohm's. He may not have had the talent to articulate things so clearly, but his insight was direct and fundamental. What Bohm did might have been more like what a scientist typically does. He may have made in his mind a model of consciousness, a kind of mental image that showed the operations of thought and emotion in a very precise and accurate manner. And on the basis of this model, he was able to describe the dynamics of consciousness in a very lucid and colorful manner. Krishnamurti, by contrast, probably did not operate in terms of any model of consciousness. His observations were evidently based upon the direct and immediate inspection of his own state of mind, as well as what he observed in others. Sometimes I think that Krishnamurti's genius may have been a little bit like that of Magnus Carlsen. That's the 20-year-old chess prodigy who today is the youngest person ever to become the top chess player in the world. An interviewer recently suggested to Magnus that he could be considered the Mozart of chess and asked him how he achieved his incredible success. But Magnus was completely unable to say how he does what he does. All he could say was that if you asked Mozart the same question, Mozart wouldn't be able to answer either. Now, this analogy is very partial because Krishnamurti was in fact enormously expressive and communicative, but I sometimes feel his facility for expression may not have been entirely equal to the depth of his insight. And so, in the final analysis, I think we have to conclude that Krishnamurti and Bohm did not have a total meeting of minds. Instead, they ran along parallel tracks for a remarkable distance, 20 years or more. Bohm was perhaps more articulate in some areas, whereas Krishnamurti's insight was more direct and fundamental. Each man helps illuminate the other, and by studying them both in their mutual context, we gain a greater understanding not only of them both, but also, perhaps, of ourselves as well. So, I think we're doing pretty good on time. We probably have a few minutes for a few questions in case there happen to be any. Yes, Karen.
Thanks, David. I'm wondering if you want to comment about, in the book Infinite Potential, there's quite a lot said about David's depression. Mm-hmm. And some people have said that he died of a broken heart, breaking his heart for the world that he was so confounded by. I wondered if you have anything to say about that.
Right. Well, Karen is referring to the book Infinite Potential by the author David Peat. And that book is the only full-scale biography of Bohm. And my general impression of that, Peat is fundamentally a science writer. He's written in the field of science many times. And my impression of that book is that his expositions of Bohm's scientific work are marvelous. Very succinct, very clear. But when Peat enters into the psychological field, I personally feel he gets a little fuzzy. Now, there's no question Bohm suffered from depression at various times in his life, and it did become pretty acute towards the end of his life. But to say that the depression broke his heart, I'm a little bit doubtful about that. Bohm did suffer serious heart trouble quite a few years before he died and had a multiple bypass operation. And an operation of that kind can precipitate depression. So it could be that the causal relationship worked in the other direction. But these are murky areas, and I don't know if any of us really know for sure the final answer. Yes, Ralph?
How long did it take you to write your book? I'm just curious. Have you been working
what a question.
For years?
Years.
Yeah.
Yes, it went through several different versions. I mean, from the time I left Oak Grove, which was more than 20 years ago, I was thinking I had to write that book. And it went through a variety of versions. The version that you see, the actual composition of the version you see, occurred during a space of about 2 years. But it took a long time to acquire the focus. And then once it was written, it had to be revised, first by me, then by the editors at Quest Books, so it's kind of an endless process.
In the same book that Karen's referring to, David Bohm in his letters mentioned a lot of frustration with Krishnamurti.
Yeah.
And in particular feeling that because of Krishnamurti's position, or even the way he thought about himself, that it was difficult to disagree with him.
Yeah.
Him as a human being with faults. It was like his positive and negative parts were both part of the truth, and that appeared at that point, I don't know how David Bohm felt later, but it appeared to be very difficult for David Bohm as a result. Do you have any understanding of what he went through or why?
Well, my understanding of those particular letters you're referring to are that they weren't included in the first edition of Peat's book, but then they were brought to his attention by the individual who had received the letters, who was someone who shared those negative sympathies about Krishnamurti, and that may have been the reason why Bohm selected that person to write those things. And my understanding also is there was a follow-up letter which Peat neglected to include, in which Bohm said to the person he was writing, please disregard those previous letters. They were written in a moment of frustration and anxiety, and they don't really represent my characteristic views. So I think there's a lot of controversy around those letters.
I mean, I do feel that, I've heard that too, but it's almost like strike that from the record. It's kind of a hard thing to do because...
Hard to unring that bell.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, you want to at least understand what was going on between them that would make
Yeah.
David feel so negative at some point in his life.
The only slightly more definitive thing I can say about that is I had a lot of conversations with Bohm about everything to do with Krishnamurti, the personal interaction, the nature of the teachings, Bohm's understanding of it, etc. He didn't talk to me like that. He had a lot of opportunity to express that kind of frustration. It didn't come out in my observations. Yes?
I just didn't quite get a clear picture of the subjects that Bohm and Krishnamurti dealt with when they collaborated. Was it
Yeah.
philosophy? Was it in
Uh-huh.
general?
You know, one of the books that they published together is entitled The Limits of Thought. So that kind of gives you a clue that they're talking about the nature of thought, the structure of thought, the kind of the inner dynamics of the thinking process. That was kind of the level that they had in common. But that could go in a lot of directions. For example, there's another book, I think it's called Truth and Actuality, and this is a more philosophical thing in which they try to distinguish between those basic aspects of reality. So it actually covered quite a lot of territory. More or less whatever was on Bohm's mind he would bring up because he wanted, it was kind of like he wanted to get Krishnamurti's confirmation for what his latest ideas were, but it covered a lot of ground. They also wrote a book at the end called The Future of Humanity, in which they considered, you know, what are the prospects given our present sense of where mankind is at. So they found a lot to talk about. Yes?
I just want to share with the audience, I don't know how many there are, but I had the pleasure the other night of looking at a YouTube upload of a conversation between these two individuals, which was fascinating.
Fascinating, yeah. Oh, good. Do you remember what it was called?
No, of course not. But if you Google one of those names or both, or maybe
Yeah.
the two of them together, you'll
together.
yeah, and YouTube, it'll come up. I don't know if there's more than one. I just watched the one, but it was fun.
Cool. Ulrich.
David, you said that you're not sure if these two men really met. They might have just moved in parallel universes. My feeling is that they met to a certain level, and then Bohm couldn't go further. And I would like to give an example. There was a dialogue they had in Rockwood, and they inquired together in the nature of consciousness and thought. And at one time, David Bohm asked Krishnamurti, he said, "That's what you mean by the unlimited mind, or by the eternal mind?" And Krishnamurti said, "No, sir, that is just the beginning."
Well, may I give you a counterexample? Somebody came to Krishnaji, who is very, very well versed in computers, and for a moment he convinced Krishnaji that the computer was eventually going to outstrip the human brain. And that very afternoon, Bohm came into town. He had to fly overnight, and he was kind of exhausted, but he came into town just in the nick of time for a group meeting we had, and Krishnamurti repeated this conclusion, this kind of apprehension he had developed that the computer was going to outstrip the human brain. And Bohm thought about that for a minute, and he said, "No, sir." He said the human brain is infinite. And Krishnamurti's face lit up, and he said, "Quite right, sir. The human brain is infinite." So it might go both ways to some extent. Yes, Rex.
Were you at some of their talks?
You know, most of the recorded dialogues between them, I think the majority probably occurred in Brockwood Park. They did do some here, and I observed a little bit, but mostly I've just read it and seen it on videotape. Well, I think we have a few minutes left, and oh yes, please, Tom.
Just to sort of fill out the picture, after Krishnamurti died, David did continue to come to Ojai.
Yeah.
Could you speak to his work that he engaged with some of us afterwards?
Yeah, it was fabulous. We formed a little committee called the Bohm Committee, and we set up these seminars for him every year, 5 or 6 years running. And at the Oak Grove School, we would meet in the library, and people would come for a weekend, Friday night, Saturday morning, Saturday evening, Sunday morning, 5 sessions. And these were recorded and transcribed, and they're available, all of them, under the University of Michigan dissertation services. And the best one was brought out and published as a book by Routledge. It's called Thought as a System. And it's a marvelous book. It's very, it's full of Bohm's very lucid way of expressing things. He had a genius for thinking up colorful metaphors and ways of expressing things which are totally unique and his own. And the book is kind of chock full of those. It's a wonderful way of accessing this material for people who find Krishnamurti, for whatever reason, not quite so comprehensible. Yeah.
And just to sort of get your take on this, since you've been close to these guys for so long, could you speak to his, well, I don't want to say his answer, his recommendation, but his whole notion of a group of people having dialogues with no leader and,
Aha, the Bohm dialogue process. Ah, yes. Oh dear. I wish I could give it my highest endorsement, but I sat through a lot of those meetings, and I think, let's just say it's a work in progress. It's a wonderful model. The idea was that a group of people would meet, and all of the normal restrictions on group conversation would be lifted. There would be no moderator, no facilitator, no agenda, fundamentally no rules. There was a spirit of dialogue that was supposed to prevail, in which, it was intended that differences would come out. That's why you couldn't have a dialogue with 7 people or less, because they would form a little clique and differences wouldn't come out. So you had to have at least 7 people, so people would start disagreeing. And then when they did that, their underlying assumptions would be exposed, and the other people in the group would come in and show how the problem is with the underlying assumptions. And then out of that process, there would come some kind of reconciliation. And with this process repeated throughout the world, it was going to save the world. The Israelis and Palestinians were going to sit down with Bohm dialogue and fix everything. Well, it's a marvelous vision, and maybe it can work, but it did not work when I observed it. Certain characteristic kinds of problems arose over and over, and so anyway.
One of the interesting parts of that process was that he collected it from the Native Americans.
Aha, that was one of the sources. There were other sources. He was involved in a group psychotherapy thing in England with a famous psychotherapist. But yes, the Native Americans was one of the sources for that model. Yeah, he had this image of the 20 tribe members sitting around the campfire at night, and they didn't come to any decision, but at the end of it, they knew what to do. It was a great model. Yes?
But he also said that his form of dialogue is not something final, not a final model.
Not final, yeah.
He said he personally wants, I'm just experimenting.
Yeah,
If it
quite.
doesn't work, you have to change it.
Absolutely. He knew it was a work in progress, experimental. Yeah, quite right. So anyway, my book is on sale for $5 off. And Adele, my dear, Sousa is not feeling well, and I was wondering if you could possibly assist us in the sale of the books.
Yes, with pleasure.
Thank you so much. So I think we're done for today.